They called it a piece of junk. A rusty relic that belonged in a museum, not on a shooting range. A 78-year-old man with a cane in one hand and a battered Winchester model, 1897 in the other, walked up to the firing line at a charity clay shoot, and every single competitor behind the safety rope started laughing. One of them, a guy in a $500 Beretta shooting vest with more patches than a NASCAR driver, pointed at the old man's shotgun and said loud enough for the entire crowd to hear, "Somebody tell Grandpa the war's been over for 80 years. The laughter doubled. The old man said nothing. He stepped into the box, shouldered that beat-up trench gun, called Pull, and for the next 6 minutes he didn't miss a single clay. Not one. 25 for 25. Perfect score. And by the time the last orange disc exploded into dust against a bright blue sky, nobody was laughing anymore. If you believe that respect is earned through actions and not appearances, comment the word honour right now before we continue. The charity shoot was called the Patriots Pull, and it had been held every October for the past 11 years on the sprawling grounds of the Ridgewater Sporting Club just outside of Lexington, Kentucky. The event raised money for wounded veterans and Gold Star families, and it attracted shooters from across the tri-state area. Some came for the cause, most came for the competition, and a few came because it was the kind of event where you could show off a $12,000 over-under Perazzi and have people actually notice. The morning of the 11th annual Patriots Pull broke cold and sharp, with frost still clinging to the grass at 7 in the morning, and a sky so blue it looked painted. By 8 o'clock the parking lot was full of pickup trucks and SUVs, tailgates down, gun cases open, men in expensive vests and polarized shooting glasses, milling around the registration tent drinking coffee from styrofoam cups and talking about choke tubes and shot patterns. The teams were organized into squads of 5, rotating through 5 stations of 5 targets each for a total of 25 clays per shooter. Standard rules, standard format. Nothing unusual about any of it, except for the man who walked up to the registration table at exactly 8:15 carrying a shotgun that looked like it had been pulled from a trench in France. His name was Earl Jessup, and he was 78 years old. He walked with a slight limp and used a wooden cane that had been worn smooth at the handle from years of use. He was thin but not frail, with a wiry kind of toughness that suggested a life spent working with his hands rather than sitting behind a desk. His face was deeply lined, weathered by sun and time, and his hair was white and cropped close to his skull in a style that hadn't changed in 50 years. He wore a faded red flannel shirt, a pair of khaki trousers that had been washed so many times they were almost white, and a pair of brown work boots that were cracked at the toes. He didn't look like a competitive shooter. He looked like someone's grandfather who had wandered away from a yard sale, and slung over his shoulder on a leather strap that was cracked and darkened with age was a Winchester Model 1897 pump-action shotgun that looked every bit as old and worn as the man carrying it. The bluing on the barrel was almost entirely gone, replaced by a patina of rust and use that gave the metal a rough, mottled appearance. The walnut stock was scarred and dented, with a long crack running along the wrist that had been repaired at some point with what appeared to be wood glue and a prayer. The action was stiff and the pump handle rattled slightly when the gun moved. The barrel had a bayonet lug on the end of it, which meant this wasn't just any Model 1897. This was a trench gun. The same model that American soldiers had carried into the Argonne Forest in 1918 and onto the beaches of the Pacific in 1944. A combat weapon, designed for close-quarters fighting, with a shorter barrel and a heat shield that had long since been removed from this particular specimen. It was, by any modern standard, an antique, and it had no business being on a sporting clays course in the 21st century. Earl walked up to the registration table, set his cane against the edge, and told the young woman behind the folding table that he'd like to sign up. She looked at him, looked at the gun, and to her credit, simply asked for his name and his $20 entry fee. Earl paid in cash, exact change, folded bills from a leather wallet that was as worn as everything else he owned. She handed him a scorecard and a pair of foam earplugs still in their plastic wrapper, and told him he was assigned to Squad 7, Station 1, starting at 9 o'clock. Earl nodded, tucked the scorecard into his shirt pocket, and walked slowly toward the waiting area near the first station. That was when the trouble started. Not trouble in the violent sense. Trouble in the way that cruelty often begins, with a smirk and a whispered comment that's meant to be overheard. The other 4 members of Squad 7 were already there, and they had been watching Earl's approach with the kind of expressions that fell somewhere between amusement and disbelief. The first was a man named Trent Calloway, 43 years old, an orthodontist from Louisville who shot competitively at least twice a month and owned more shotguns than most people owned shoes. He was wearing a custom Beretta shooting vest with his name embroidered on the chest, polarized Oakley shooting glasses, and a hat from a Sporting Clays Invitational in San Antonio that he'd finished fourth in the previous year. Trent was the one who had made the crack about the war being over, and he wasn't done. The second was Kyle Reddick, 36, a real estate developer who had taken up shooting 2 years ago and had thrown money at the hobby the way he threw money at everything, which meant he had the best equipment and middling talent. The third was Dale Furman, 51, a quiet insurance adjuster who was a decent shot but preferred to stay out of confrontations. And the fourth was Brett Howell, 29, a former college baseball player who had the hand-eye coordination to be genuinely good at this, but lacked the discipline to practice consistently. Trent looked at Earl's Winchester the way a sommelier might look at a box of wine. He tilted his head, crossed his arms over his embroidered vest and said, "Sir, I don't mean any disrespect, but are you sure that thing is safe to fire?" Earl looked at him with steady grey eyes that didn't blink. "It fires," Earl said. His voice was quiet, not weak, but controlled. The kind of voice that belonged to someone who had learned a long time ago that volume was not the same thing as authority. "I can see that it fires," Trent said, smiling at Kyle, who was already grinning. "What I'm asking is whether it fires in the right direction," Kyle laughed. Brett tried not to. Dale looked at his shoes. Earl said nothing. He simply leaned on his cane and looked out at the first station, where a clay thrower was being loaded by a volunteer in an orange vest. Trent kept going, the way people do when they mistake silence for weakness. "Look, this is a charity event, so obviously everyone's welcome, but we're trying to compete here. That thing doesn't even have a ventilated rib. How are you going to track a clay with a bead sight on a combat barrel?" Earl looked at Trent for a long moment. Then he said, very simply, "The same way I've always done it." And then he turned back toward the first station and didn't say another word. The first station was a standard crossing target, left to right, thrown at moderate speed from a tower about 40 yards out. It was the kind of target that warmed you up. Not too fast, not too tricky, just a clean orange disc arcing across the sky waiting to be turned into dust. Trent shot first. He mounted his Beretta 694 Sporting, a gun that retailed for just under $4,000, called Pull, tracked the clay smoothly and broke it cleanly at about 30 yards. A good shot. He lowered his gun with the practiced ease of someone who expected to hit what he aimed at and stepped back. Kyle went next with his Browning Citori, broke the clay on his second shot after missing the first, and shrugged it off with a laugh. Brett hit his on the first pull with a quick athletic swing. Dale hit his cleanly too, quiet and efficient. And then it was Earl's turn. He stepped into the box slowly, planting his cane against the wooden frame of the shooting station. He reached down, picked up a single shell from the small canvas bag he carried on his belt, and loaded it into the Winchester's tubular magazine. The action was loud in the silence. That heavy, distinctive chunk of a pump shotgun being racked, a sound that hadn't changed in over 100 years. He shouldered the gun. And this is where the first crack appeared in the wall of assumptions that everyone had built around Earl Jessup, because the way he shouldered that shotgun was not the way an old man picks up a hobby. It was the way a piece of steel becomes an extension of bone and muscle, a single fluid motion that started at his feet and ended at his cheek, and when the stock settled into the pocket of his shoulder, it fit there like it had been carved for him. His left hand wrapped around the pump handle with a grip that was firm without being rigid. His right hand found the trigger guard like it was coming home. His posture shifted. The limp disappeared. The cane was forgotten. He wasn't leaning on anything anymore. He was standing the way a man stands when he knows exactly who he is and exactly what he's about to do. "Pull," Earl said. The clay launched, and Earl Jessup did something that made every single person watching take a half step back. He broke the clay at 20 yards. Not 30, not 35, 20. The orange disc had barely cleared the top of its arc when the Winchester barked once. A sharp, authoritative crack that echoed across the field, and the clay simply ceased to exist. It didn't chip. It didn't crack. It vaporized into a cloud of orange dust that hung in the air for a moment before the breeze carried it away. And the thing that made it extraordinary wasn't just the speed of the shot, it was the speed of the pump. Earl racked the action and had the gun back on his shoulder in a motion so fast and so smooth that it looked like a magic trick. The empty shell ejected, a fresh round chambered, and the gun was ready to fire again before the fragments of the first clay had finished falling. It was the kind of pump-action speed that you read about in old military manuals, the legendary slam-fire technique that made the Model 1897 the most feared close combat weapon of the First World War. And Earl Jessup could still do it like he'd been born with that gun in his hands. Nobody said a word. Trent's smile had frozen on his face like someone had hit the pause button on his personality. Kyle's mouth was slightly open. Brett was staring at Earl with the expression of an athlete who had just recognised another athlete. And Dale, the quiet insurance adjuster, was nodding slowly, like a man who had just had a suspicion confirmed. Earl stepped out of the box, picked up his cane, and waited for the squad to move to the next station. Station 2 was a going-away target, launched from a bunker behind the shooters and flying straight out, getting smaller by the second. It required quick reflexes and a tight choke. Trent hit his, Kyle missed, Brett hit his, Dale hit his. Earl loaded a single shell, shouldered the Winchester with that same fluid certainty, called pull, and dusted the clay before it had travelled 15 yards. The sound of the shot was still ringing when the pump racked back, and the empty hull spun through the air, catching the morning light. Station 3 was an incoming target, high and fast, the kind that makes you want to shoot under it because every instinct in your body tells you it's closer than it is. Trent hit his, barely, the clay chipping instead of breaking clean. Kyle missed again and cursed under his breath. Brett missed this one too. Dale hit it solid. And Earl stepped into the box, loaded his shell, called pull, and waited. He waited longer than anyone expected. The clay grew larger and larger in the sky, screaming toward the station, and just when it seemed like he had waited too long, Earl fired. The clay exploded directly overhead, raining orange fragments down on the shooting box like confetti. Earl didn't flinch. He didn't look up. He simply racked the pump, ejected the empty hull, and stepped out of the box. 12 for 12. 4 stations to go, and the silence around Squad 7 had become the kind of silence that spreads, the kind that pulls spectators from other stations, the kind that makes people stop what they're doing and walk over to see what everyone else is looking at. By Station 4, there were at least 30 people gathered behind the safety rope, and by Station 5 there were over 50. Earl Jessup was running a perfect score, and he was doing it with a shotgun that was older than everyone watching. Station 4 was a true pair, 2 clays launched simultaneously from different angles, one high and left, one low and right. You had to break both. With a semi-automatic, you had a fraction of a second of advantage because the gun cycled itself. With a pump, you had to rack the action between shots, which meant you needed to be faster, smoother, and more decisive. Trent broke both of his with his semi-auto, but his second shot was late, catching the clay at the very edge of range. Kyle broke one and missed the other. Brett broke both cleanly. Dale broke one and missed the second by inches, and then Earl stepped up. He loaded 2 shells into the magazine, shouldered the gun, and called pull. 2 clays launched. Earl swung left, fired, racked the pump in a motion so fast that the sound of the ejecting shell and the sound of the action closing blended into a single metallic syllable, swung right, and fired again. Both clays broke. The elapsed time between the first shot and the second was less than a second. Someone in the crowd behind the rope said, "Holy God." Someone else said something that was far less appropriate for a charity event. Trent didn't say anything. He was standing with his $4,000 Beretta cradled in his arms, and his face had gone through several phases in the past 20 minutes. It had started with amusement, moved through surprise, settled briefly on disbelief, and was now firmly in the territory of something that looked a lot like shame. Not the kind of shame that comes from losing a competition. The kind that comes from realizing you've been laughing at someone who deserves your silence. Kyle had stopped talking entirely, which, according to people who knew him, was unprecedented. Brett was watching Earl with open admiration, the way a young athlete watches a legend play. And Dale had a small, quiet smile on his face that he was trying very hard to hide. Station 5, the last station, 5 targets. Earl Jessup had hit 20 out of 20. A perfect score was within reach, and by now the word had spread across the entire Ridgewater Sporting Club. People were abandoning their own stations, walking across the dewy grass with their guns broken open over their shoulders, gathering behind the safety rope at Station 5 to watch a 78-year-old man with a cane and a century-old trench gun try to run a clean sheet at the Patriots Pull. The Station 5 targets were the hardest on the course. They were called chandelles, clays launched at a steep upward angle that rose high, seemed to hang for a moment at the apex and then dropped sharply. The trajectory was deceptive, the speed was variable, and the angle required you to shoot almost vertically at the peak. It was the station that separated serious shooters from casual ones, and even among the serious ones, it was the station where perfect scores came to die. Trent hit 3 of 5, Kyle hit 2, Brett hit 4, Dale hit 3. The pressure was entirely on Earl now, and everyone knew it. The crowd behind the rope had grown to nearly 100 people. Someone had pulled out their phone and was filming. A child sitting on his father's shoulders pointed at Earl and asked why the old man's gun was so rusty, and his father whispered something in his ear that made the boy go quiet. Earl stepped into the box for the last time. He set his cane against the frame and reached into his canvas shell bag. He loaded 5 shells into the magazine one by one, each one seated with a deliberate press of his thumb. He shouldered the Winchester, and then he paused. He didn't call pull right away. He stood there for a moment with the gun against his shoulder and his eyes on the sky, and something changed in his face. The hard, controlled expression softened, just barely, just enough for someone standing close to notice. His lips moved, but no sound came out. Maybe he was counting, maybe he was praying, maybe he was talking to someone who wasn't there anymore. Then his eyes hardened again, and he called pull. The first chandelle launched, screaming skyward at a steep angle. Earl tracked it up, and fired at the apex. The clay shattered. He racked the pump. The second clay launched. Same trajectory, slightly different angle. Earl swung, fired, broke it clean. Racked the pump. Shell 3. The third clay was the fastest of the set, launched with extra spring tension, and it rose like a bottle rocket. Earl's swing was smooth, unhurried, almost graceful. He fired. The clay exploded into a puff of orange at the top of its flight. Racked the pump. Shell 4. The fourth clay launched with a wobble, a slight manufacturing defect that made it flutter and dip unpredictably. It was the kind of target that made experienced shooters hesitate. Earl didn't hesitate. He read the wobble, adjusted his lead, and fired. The clay broke apart in mid-flutter. The crowd was holding its breath. One more. 24 for 24. One more clay between Earl Jessup and a perfect score. Rack the pump for the final time. Called pull. The last chandelle launched. It rose against that impossibly blue Kentucky sky, climbing and climbing until it seemed to touch the sun. Earl tracked it with the patience of a man who had been aiming at things his entire life, and at the moment the clay reached its peak, hanging in the air like a period at the end of a sentence, he squeezed the trigger. The Winchester barked. The clay disintegrated. 25 for 25. The crowd erupted. There is no other word for it. They erupted in a roar of applause and cheering and whistling that rolled across the fields of the Ridgewater Sporting Club like thunder. People who had never met Earl Jessup were clapping him on the back. A woman near the front of the crowd had tears streaming down her face. The child on his father's shoulders was clapping so hard his little hands were red, and Earl Jessup stood in the shooting box with the Winchester hanging loose in his right hand and his left hand reaching for his cane, and he nodded. Just once. A small, quiet nod. The kind of acknowledgement that comes from a man who has lived long enough to know that a perfect score on a clay range is a small thing compared to some of the other things he's done in his life. But it's still worth a nod. He stepped out of the box and began walking slowly back toward the registration tent, and that's when Trent Calloway did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He stepped in front of Earl, and he apologized. Not a casual throwaway apology, a real one, the kind that costs something. "Sir," Trent said, and his voice was different now, stripped of the practiced confidence, the easy superiority. "Sir, I owe you an apology. What I said earlier was disrespectful, and it was wrong, and I'm sorry." Earl looked at Trent for a long moment, the same steady grey eyes, the same expression that gave nothing away. Then he said, "Son, I've been laughed at by better than you, and I've been shot at by worse. Don't lose sleep over it." And he kept walking. But the day was not over, and what happened next turned a remarkable shooting performance into something that no one at the Ridgewater Sporting Club would ever forget. As Earl was making his way toward the parking lot, A black Suburban with government plates pulled into the gravel drive and stopped. The driver's door opened and a man stepped out wearing the dress uniform of the United States Army, the dark blue jacket with gold buttons, the service ribbons stacked in precise rows above the left breast pocket, the insignia of a 2-star Major General gleaming on his shoulders. He was in his mid-50s, tall and broad-shouldered, with the bearing of someone who had spent his entire adult life in positions of authority. His name was Major General David Rains, and he had driven 3 hours from Fort Campbell to be here, and the reason he had driven 3 hours had nothing to do with clay shooting. The general walked across the parking lot with the kind of purposeful stride that parts crowds without the walker being conscious of it. People stepped aside. Conversation stopped. A 2-star general in full-dress uniform at a charity clay shoot in Kentucky was not something anyone had expected to see that morning, and the effect was immediate and electric. The general's eyes scanned the crowd, found Earl Jessup limping toward his truck and locked on. He walked straight to Earl and stopped 3 feet in front of him. And then Major General David Rains, a man who commanded 20,000 soldiers and oversaw operations across 3 continents, did something that made every single person in that parking lot stop breathing. He came to attention, heels together, back straight, chin up, and he saluted. "Sergeant Major Jessup," General Rains said, his voice carrying across the silent parking lot with the clarity of a man trained to be heard over the noise of helicopters and artillery. "It has been a long time, and I have been looking for you." Earl stood very still. The cane stopped moving. The Winchester hung from its strap. He looked at General Rains with an expression that shifted just barely, from the controlled mask he had worn all day to something else. Something that might have been recognition. Something that might have been memory. Something that, if you watched closely, might have been the very beginning of tears in those steady grey eyes. "General Rains," Earl said quietly. "You got tall." A sound came from the crowd that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob. The general did not drop his salute. He held it rigid, textbook perfect, and his eyes were bright. "Sir," the general said, and the use of the word sir from a 2-star general to an old man with a cane and a rusty shotgun sent a ripple through the crowd that was almost physical. "I need to tell these people who you are. I need them to understand what they've been looking at today. Do I have your permission?" Earl was silent for a long time. The breeze ruffled his white hair. Somewhere in the distance a clay thrower fired, the mechanical arm slapping forward and sending an orange disc into the sky. Finally Earl said, "I'd rather you didn't." The general lowered his salute. "Sergeant Major, with all due respect, I'm going to do it anyway." Earl looked at him. Then, very slowly, the corner of his mouth turned up. Not quite a smile, the ghost of one. "You always were stubborn, Lieutenant," Earl said. General Rains turned to face the crowd, which by now had grown to include virtually every person at the Patriots Pull. Over 200 people standing in a gravel parking lot in the October morning cold, and not one of them was making a sound. "My name is Major General David Rains, United States Army," he began. 31 years ago, I was a second lieutenant, fresh out of West Point, assigned to my first combat deployment. I was 23 years old, and I was terrified, and the only reason I survived my first year in uniform is because of the man standing behind me. This man is retired Sergeant Major Earl Jessup. He served 34 years in the United States Army. He completed 6 combat deployments across 3 wars. He was wounded 4 times. He received the Silver Star twice. He received the Bronze Star with Valor Device 3 times. He received the Purple Heart 4 times. He's a recipient of the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest valor award this nation can bestow upon a soldier, for actions during a firefight in which he single-handedly held a position for over 4 hours to protect a group of wounded soldiers, including a young second lieutenant named David Rains, who had taken shrapnel in both legs and couldn't walk. The general's voice wavered. He paused. He steadied himself. Sergeant Major Jessup carried me 800 meters through hostile territory on his back. He was 51 years old at the time. He was already wounded himself. He refused medical evacuation until every single one of his men was accounted for, and when the medevac finally came, the medics had to order him onto the helicopter because he wanted to go back for a soldier who was still missing. The general paused again. His jaw was set. His eyes were locked on a point above the crowd, the way a soldier locks his eyes when he's trying not to break. The missing soldier was found the next day, alive, because Sergeant Major Jessup had gone back, against orders, in the dark, alone, and he brought that boy home. The silence in the parking lot was absolute, the kind of silence that rings. General Rains turned back to Earl. Sergeant Major Jessup retired 15 years ago. He refused every award ceremony. He refused every reunion invitation. He didn't want attention. He didn't want recognition. He wanted to go home, tend his garden, and be left alone. And I respected that. For 15 years, I respected that. But last month, the Department of the Army approved Sergeant Major Jessup for the upgrade of his Distinguished Service Cross to the Medal of Honor, based on a review of his entire service record and the testimonies of 47 soldiers who served under him. 47. And every single one of them said the same thing. They said that Earl Jessup was the finest soldier they had ever known, and that they were alive because of him. General Rains reached into the interior pocket of his dress jacket and withdrew a folded letter. This is the official notification. The ceremony will be held at the White House, and I drove 3 hours today to deliver this in person because some things cannot be mailed and some things should not be said over a telephone. He extended the letter toward Earl. Earl looked at it. His hand trembled as he reached for it, and for the first time all day, the strength in those hands, the hands that had pumped a trench gun with machine-like precision just 30 minutes ago, faltered. He took the letter and held it without opening it. His jaw worked. His throat moved. His eyes were wet. "I don't need a medal, David," Earl said. His voice was barely above a whisper, but in the silence of that parking lot every person heard him clearly. "I was just doing my job." General Rains shook his head. "No, Sergeant Major. What you did was beyond any job description. What you did was beyond any order ever given. What you did was choose, every single time, to put your body between danger and the people who depended on you, and this nation owes you more than a medal. It owes you its memory." Earl stood there for a long moment. The breeze moved across the parking lot. A flag snapped on a pole near the entrance to the club. Somewhere, a bird called out from the tree line. Then Earl Jessup straightened. It was subtle, almost invisible, but to anyone watching carefully his posture changed. The limp seemed to lessen. The cane bore a little less weight. His shoulders squared, just barely, in the way they must have squared 1,000 times before, on 1,000 different fields, in 1,000 different moments when the world asked something impossible, and Earl Jessup answered by standing up straighter. He tucked the letter into the pocket of his faded red flannel shirt, right next to his scorecard. "Tell them I'll be there," Earl said. The crowd broke. There is no better way to describe it. The controlled silence shattered into applause and cheers and tears, and people surged forward, not aggressively, but with a kind of gravitational pull, the way people move towards something true. Trent Calloway was standing near the front of the crowd, and his face was wet, and he didn't care who saw it. He extended his hand toward Earl. "Sergeant Major Jessup," Trent said, and there was nothing left of the smirking orthodontist from Louisville. "It is the honor of my life to shake your hand." Earl took his hand. Squeezed it once. "You're a decent shot," Earl said. "You just need to slow down. You're rushing your second barrel." Trent let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. Kyle Reddick was next in line, and the man who had laughed the loudest that morning could barely speak. "I'm sorry, sir," he said. "I didn't know." Earl looked at him with those steady grey eyes. "That's the point, son. You never know. That's why you should always be kind." Brett Howell stepped forward and simply said, "Thank you for your service, Sergeant Major," and Earl nodded, and Dale Furman, the quiet insurance adjuster, shook Earl's hand without saying a word, because Dale, it turned out later, was a veteran himself, and he had known from the moment Earl shouldered that Winchester that he was watching a man who had done something far more significant than shoot clay pigeons. The event coordinator rushed over with a trophy for the highest individual score, a small brass cup on a wooden base, and presented it to Earl in front of the entire crowd. Earl accepted it, looked at it for a moment, and then handed it to the young boy who had been sitting on his father's shoulders. "You keep that," Earl told the boy, "and when you're old enough, you come out here and earn one yourself." The boy held the trophy with both hands, eyes wide, and nodded solemnly. In the weeks that followed, the video of Earl Jessup running a perfect 25 at the Patriots Pull went viral. The footage had been shot on a phone by a spectator who had started filming at Station 3, and within a week it had over 4 million views. News outlets picked it up. Veteran organisations shared it. The Ridgewater Sporting Club was flooded with calls and letters. The footage of General Rains saluting Earl in the parking lot, captured by a different spectator from a different angle, became one of the most shared military tribute videos of the year. But the most remarkable thing that happened was not the views or the press coverage. It was what happened at the Ridgewater Sporting Club itself. The club's board of directors voted unanimously to rename the annual charity event the Jessup Patriots Pull. They created a new award, the Jessup Award for Distinguished Sportsmanship, given each year to the competitor who best exemplified respect, humility and excellence. Trent Calloway funded the award out of his own pocket and insisted that his name not be attached to it. The club also established a youth shooting program specifically for children of veterans, and they asked Earl to serve as honorary chairman. Earl declined the title but agreed to come out once a month to teach the kids. He showed up every first Saturday morning with his cane, his canvas shell bag, and the Winchester Model 1897 that his father had carried in the Second World War and his grandfather had carried in the First, a gun that had been in the Jessup family for over 100 years and had seen more of the world than most people ever would. And on those Saturday mornings, Earl would stand behind a young boy or girl, gently adjust their stance, speak in that quiet, steady voice about patience and focus and follow-through, and when the clay launched and the child hit it for the first time, Earl would nod, just once. That same small, quiet nod, and the child would glow. The Medal of Honor ceremony was held 3 months later at the White House. Earl Jessup stood in the East Room in a new suit that his daughter had insisted on buying him, with his family around him and 47 former soldiers in the audience who had served under him, some of them grey-haired now, some of them in wheelchairs, some of them holding small American flags, and all of them crying. General Rains was there in full dress, standing at attention in the front row. The President of the United States placed the pale blue ribbon around Earl's neck, and the weight of the medal settled against his chest, and Earl Jessup stood at attention for the last time in his life and held a salute that carried the weight of 34 years, 6 deployments, 4 wounds, 800 meters through hostile territory with a broken lieutenant on his back, and one quiet morning in Kentucky where he reminded the world that the measure of a man is not the shine on his equipment, but the steel in his soul. After the ceremony, a reporter asked Earl what he wanted people to remember about him. Earl thought about it for a moment, leaning on his cane, the Medal of Honor gleaming against his new suit. Then he said, "I was a soldier, and I was a pretty good shot," and that was all he said. The Winchester Model 1897 is now displayed in a glass case at the Ridgewater Sporting Club, on loan from the Jessup family, with a small brass plaque that reads, "This weapon was carried by 3 generations of the Jessup family in service to the United States of America. It was last fired in competition by Sergeant Major Earl Jessup, U.S. Army, retired, Medal of Honor recipient at the age of 78. Score 25 for 25. Perfect." And every October, at the Jessup Patriots Pull, before the first clay is thrown, the competitors gather at the first station and they observe a moment of silence. Not for the dead, for the living. For the old men and women who carry their scars quietly, who endure the laughter and the dismissal and the assumptions of people who do not know what they have done and what they have survived, and who, when the moment comes, when the clay is launched and the trigger is pulled, do not miss. They never miss. Because missing was never an option. Not in the trenches, not in the jungle, not in the desert, and not on a clear October morning in Kentucky when the sky was blue and the clays were flying and a 78-year-old man with a cane and a rusty trench gun reminded every single person watching that the quietest people in the room are almost always the most dangerous, and the most humble are almost always the most heroic. And that respect is not a gift you give to someone who earns it in front of you. It's a debt you owe to everyone you meet, because you never know who they are. You never know what they've done. You never know what they carry. So the next time you see an old man with a cane and a rusty gun and worn-out boots and a faded red shirt, do yourself a favor. Don't laugh. Listen. Watch. And maybe, just maybe, you'll learn something about what it really means to be great. Subscribe to this channel if you believe that every veteran deserves respect, that courage doesn't come with an expiration date, and that the truest heroes are the ones who never tell you what they've done. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. And the next time someone asks you why you should never judge a person by their appearance, tell them about a man named Earl Jessup, a perfect score and a rusty trench gun that never missed.